Hello and welcome along to the industry analysis for the strategic case study of November 2018. Here we're going to be looking at the pharmaceutical industry, and it has to be said this is a really fascinating and interesting industry for many reasons, which we'll see later on. But it also has to be said that it is a very complex and unwieldy industry, very large, lots of moving parts, lots of different players and stakeholders involved. And so for that reason, what we have done is we have distilled this industry down into the most important elements, the most important features, and some of the key data points and quantitative points for you to make it easier for you to navigate your way through this industry, and also to put you in a better position then to anticipate some of the issues that might arise and problems that might arise on exam day in November. So before we get into the details, let me just give you a quick rundown of what we're going to cover in this industry analysis. We'll start with a quantitative analysis, and we'll be looking at revenue figures in recent years, profits, projections for coming years, and also look at some of the drug categories and how they differ from one another in terms of those figures. In section 2 then we'll move on to the issue of research and the approval process, everything that's involved, all the steps and phases, look at things like success rates within the industry and the costs associated with all of that. In the third section, then we're going to focus in particular on those regulatory authorities who play such a key role in shaping this industry for so many reasons. We're going to be analysing this from the perspective of incentives and again the associated costs. Then in section 4, we're going to look at the very important issue of patents, the role that they play, why they're important in this industry, the justifications for them, some of the problems that they present as well, and some of the negative consequences, and then also protocols in terms of what needs to be done in order to get a patent and how that process is executed. Section 5 then, we're going to be looking at opportunities and threats within the industry and what a company like Novak might be looking at in terms of future developments and also future threats. We're going to look at the media, we're going to look at regulations, biologics, nanotechnology, and a few other items as well. And we'll finish up there. Okay, so let's get started on that quantitative analysis. We're going to start here with revenue growth from the last few years. This is looking at a 15-year period from 2001 to 2016. You can see there from 2001 up until around 2010, there was fairly steady growth, and then it flattened off somewhat from 2010, 2011, 12, and 13. That could have a lot to do with a kind of a delayed or lag effect from the financial crisis in the previous years. As you'll be aware from the pre-scene, it takes a while for new drugs to get on the market, and of course that has a lot to do with the patent process and the regulatory process as well. And so because of that, that might account for that dip there. The dip that occurred in 2010, 11 and 12 might be a delayed result of the financial crisis from 2007, 8 and 9. So it is recovering, continues to recover, and has recovered since then. 2014, 15 and 16 showed signals and signs of a return to the normal rate of growth that had occurred from 2001 to 2010. As you can see here on the right, there's a nice little summary text. It says the statistic depicts the world revenue. In 2001, world revenue was at around 390.2 billion in US dollars, and 10 years later this figure stood at some 963 billion. In 2014, global pharmaceutical revenues for the first time increased to over 1 trillion US dollars. So that gives you a sense of just how massive this industry is from a global perspective. We're now at well over $1 trillion in the present day, trillion US dollars, and that continues to grow. As a result of these huge revenues, there is a perception out there that there are huge profits in this industry as well. Some might even say exorbitant profits, and you often see headlines to this effect in the popular media. We're going to come back to the issue of media perceptions and public perceptions of the pharmaceutical industry later on and go into more detail. But for now, I just wanted to use that as a kind of a way into this issue of profits and actually assessing what the profit rates are like within this industry. But despite this perception of high or excessive profitability because of those huge revenues, when we actually break the figures down, it's not so clear that the rate of return is all that good compared to some other industries. So here's a useful figure looking at the return from pharmaceutical innovation up until 2017. And as you can see, that's actually been falling since 2010 gone from 10.1% down to 3.2%. There's lots of reasons why that might be the case, some of which we'll be looking at a little bit later on. But according to the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, the average return on equity for key industries from 2014 to 2016 shows that biopharma's profits stand at 16.2%, I should say, significantly lower than, for example, computer sciences at 31.6%, beverages at 27.4%, aerospace and defense at 23%, and trucking at 19.1%. So you can see from that almost random selection of other industries that actually the pharmaceutical industry in terms of the rate of return on equity isn't particularly impressive. So to some extent that those claims of exorbitant profits are actually misleading, I should say, at least when you're speaking in relative terms and not only looking at the absolute figures. As for projections and the expectations for coming years, you can see there the expectation is we're looking at a fairly healthy compound annual growth rate from 2016 to 2022, and a return to the kind of the growth that we saw from 2001 to 2010. And that is growth right across the board for all of the different kinds of drugs in terms of generics, orphan drugs, and other drugs as well. This is looking at total prescription drug sales from 2008 to 2022, and this is from the Evaluate Pharma analysis of August 2016. Now we're looking at it in a little bit more detail, looking at more high resolution projection here, spending projections, breakdown based on region, product type, and then the disease area as well. The US, unsurprisingly perhaps, is the major market. It is a huge market for pharmaceutical innovation. And as we'll see, it is unique in some other respects as well. Then you've got the EU, and you have the rest of the world at 12%. The other major market in this area is China, unsurprisingly also, given its huge growth rates over recent years. Then we look at product types, and original brands are at 52%, with non-original brands then at 21%, unbranded at 14%, and then over-the-counter pharmaceuticals at 13%. So again, those original brands constituting the vast preponderance of spending. And then finally, looking at the disease area in 2020, we've got the major area is 37% non-communicable diseases, and that covers a whole range of diseases which are basically non-contagious diseases. Then you've got communicable diseases or contagious diseases at 15%, followed by oncology, which basically means cancer treatments and cancer-based drugs at 11%, diabetes at 10%, and cardiovascular then at 7%. Those are the major disease areas in terms of spending. Now, we look at this category breakdown in a little bit more detail here, and this is from the perspective of profitability. So we were looking at total spending in the previous slide. Now we want to see which disease areas tend to be the most profitable from the perspective of pharmaceutical companies, and it might surprise you actually to see which are the most profitable. The popular perception is actually that cancer is the most profitable area, and that a huge amount of research goes into that precisely because it's so profitable and because there isn't any outright cure yet. There's so much treatment out there and so many different treatment options, and that's why pharmaceutical companies are so heavily invested in the research and development of cancer drugs. But actually, it is not the case that the cancer area or segment is the most profitable. In fact, number one is dyslipidemia, which is just a fancy word for obesity treatments and drugs which treat dyslipidemia or related complications as well. So that is the number one most profitable. Number two is autoimmune diseases, type 1 diabetes, for example, and arthritis. Schizophrenia then, ADD, ADHD, and depression come under that broad category. Number four is asthma, and then number five is actually cancers in terms of profitability. The reason for this has to do with the chronic nature of those other categories. A lot of those And also in the case of obesity, it may also have to do with the fact that that is both that creates high risk for other related diseases, like for example cardiovascular disease, but also it may have something to do with things like vanity and people's anxiety about their body image and their anxiety about getting their weight down as quickly as possible. And so that's for that reason there might be a willingness to pay higher prices for those kinds of drugs. You've got autoimmune diseases then, type 1 diabetes. Again, these are chronic, often lifelong diseases, and so they require that constant spending over an entire lifetime. For that reason then, those would be considered more profitable because they guarantee a steady, constant, long-term stream of revenue. The difference in the case of cancer is, of course, that cancer is often, not often, but in some cases can be terminal, and the treatment projections in terms of the time horizon is shorter, and for that reason there isn't as much time to recoup costs from cancer-based drugs. Notwithstanding the fact that cancer isn't actually the most profitable category from the perspective of a pharmaceutical company, it is nevertheless the case that actually most medicines in the pipeline are actually for cancer. And that might to some extent belie the kind of perception or the idea that the only concern that pharmaceutical companies have is profit. And this might indicate that actually there is some kind of focus on cancer and kind of an obsession with cancer treatments, which is not actually a result simply of a kind of a uni-focus on profit and maximizing profit. To some extent, it might be the case that actually pharmaceutical companies are being a little bit irrational to the extent that they're focusing on cancer so much, and they've so many different medicines in the pipeline and in development for cancer, out of proportion perhaps to the profitability. You've got other categories here. The next category with the most medicines currently in research and development phases are neurology, which covers a whole range of different kinds of diseases, such as the psychological issues and schizophrenia related issues mentioned in the previous slide, but also certain autoimmune diseases which affect the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system as well. And then after that, you have the infectious diseases with 1,261 medicines currently in development, and immunology then after that. But cancer, in terms of quantity of drugs currently in development and under research, is quite a bit out ahead at 1,919. So we're moving on now to consider research and development and the approval process. This is, as you saw in the preceding analysis, a very lengthy process, a very costly process, and for many reasons a very risky process as well from the point of view of profit and sustainability. So we're going to start here by looking at the pharmaceutical industry from the perspective of research and development in general. It might surprise you to learn that the pharmaceutical industry is way out ahead in terms of overall investment in research and development. It is, in absolute terms and also in relative terms, the industry that spends the most on research and development by far and away. And you can see there automobiles are coming in at second, technology, hardware and equipment third, and then all the other sectors really come way, way behind in terms of spending and investment on research and development. And that really underlines the crucial importance of research and development for the pharmaceutical industry, and we'll see why that's the case a little bit later on. Here we've got a nice little overview, a visual overview of the whole research and development process from the preclinical trials right up until the approval process with those regulatory authorities. We start on the left there with the research. You have drug discovery or discovery of a molecule or a compound, and this begins then the preclinical testing phase. Usually this is done in laboratories, using cultures and samples, biological samples, for example, without actually being tested on humans. It sometimes also involves the use and testing of animals, but that is increasingly rare and increasingly not the case because of the ethical concerns raised by testing on animals. And so we're increasingly seeing that being phased out. And new technologies are then being introduced to replace the animal testing, and they're relying more on cultures, biological cultures and so on. The duration of this process can be anywhere from 3 to 6 years on average. The share of the budget which is spent on this research phase, which is the preclinical phase, is about 21.5%. The chances of success are really quite depressing actually at this stage in terms of the number of compounds that are actually screened and the ones that eventually yield a promising treatment possibility. It's 0.01%, I should say, even less than 0.01%. So a huge amount of effort and cost and time and energy is spent just sifting through potential compounds and chemical compounds that might have some kind of therapeutic or treatment possibility. And then it's moved into the preclinical phase when something promising is found. But the chances of something coming out at the end of this phase is very, very low indeed. Once that something is a promising compound is found and has passed the preclinical testing and shown some promise in terms of treatment possibility, then it's taken to the next phase of development, which is the clinical trials. You have phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 typically. Phase 1 trials usually involve small groups, often of healthy volunteers, simply as a means of testing for side effects, negative side effects, and see if there's any adverse side effects which are unforeseen in the preclinical phase. Then you move on to a larger sample. Usually you're looking here in phase 2 at people who are actually suffering from the targeted disease, and this is usually a small group of volunteers, and this is just to determine initial efficacy of the drug and to ensure that the indication from the preclinical phase actually follows through in real-life human patient testing in those with the disease. And then phase 3 is the final phase, and this is the most important phase in many respects and the most costly phase. This is where it's taken to a very large sample of the population. They use control groups, they use placebos to ensure that the effects of the drug cannot be deemed to be psychosomatic or psychological, and this is usually a very expensive and lengthy process involving many, many groups of people in many different locations to control for all sorts of environmental factors and so on. And so for that reason, phase 3 is both the most costly and time-consuming process. The duration of this from phase 1 to phase 3 can range anywhere from 6 to 7 years. The budget share is up to 65%, so really this is where most of the cost and expense comes, and particularly that phase 3. The chances of success vary, and we're going to come back to this a little later on, depending on the phase. 65% on average in phase 1, 40% in phase 2, and 50% in phase 3. Once this is done, and once a drug actually makes it through all of these various hurdles, it's finally brought to the approval stage, where it's submitted for approval by the regulatory authorities. We're going to come back and focus more on the regulatory authorities later on, because they really have to be looked at in some detail and to really understand how it is that so few drugs really make it through in the end. As you can see there on the right, the duration ongoing, the share of the budget up to 10%, the chances of a return on investment 1 to 3, so not particularly great. And we'll see later on why it's the case that even if a drug makes it through all of those clinical trials with flying colours, there is still no guarantee that it's going to actually be approved by the relevant pharmaceutical or medical authorities within the relevant country. So it's a painstaking process, and for that reason, many pharmaceutical companies enlist the help and the assistance of many third parties along the way. You have, in the earliest phases of research, you have a lot of partnerships and collaboration with academia, academic institutes and research institutes, small and medium-sized enterprises that might be specialising in one very small compound or area of specialisation in pharmacy, and these public-private partnership research centres as well, getting some public funding from the government, for example, and from institutes supported by the government. Then in the preclinical trialling, you get a lot of interest from government regulatory agencies, but also this is often where the patenting process begins to take place, and that often requires some kind of interactions with the government in terms of submitting applications and so on. Clinical trials then, sometimes this is performed in-house by the pharmaceutical companies. That's particularly the case with some of these giants, these pharmaceutical giants who have a high degree of vertical integration. time. But some of the more modestly sized or medium-sized pharmaceutical companies, they will outsource the trialing activities to these CROs. A CRO is simply a contract research organization, that is to say, an organization that specializes in performing trials on a contractual basis. And this is something that is done, and it seems as well this is becoming increasingly common because of the cost controls and reductions that these contract research organizations can achieve through specialization and the division of labor. Then you move on to government regulatory agencies again for the approval and registration process, which takes about 1 to 2 years. And then you've got post-marketing surveillance. This is done in conjunction with and in collaboration with healthcare professionals who are actually administering these drugs and who are dealing with the patients directly. And they, of course, are often enlisted to provide feedback on the efficacy of the drugs and the success and any potential adverse side effects. So, huge number of third parties being dealt with at every phase of the research and development process. Just a little bit more on these contract research organizations. As I said, a company that provides support to the pharmaceutical, biotechnology, and medical device industries in the form of research services outsourced on a contract basis. CROs are designed to reduce costs for companies developing new medicines and drugs in niche markets in particular. So they can specialize in very specific kinds of trials. For example, you get a lot of competition in this area with certain CROs specializing in the trialing of certain kinds of drug categories or disease categories, for example, in a way that, for example, a large corporation, they might have very generic facilities for testing and trialing drugs and doing the clinical trials, but these other CROs might be smaller, but they also might be more specialized and be able to reduce costs for that reason. CROs that specialize in clinical trial services can offer their clients the expertise of moving a new drug or device from its conception to FDA, EMA, or whatever the relevant regulatory body is, marketing approval, without the drug sponsor having to maintain a staff for these services. So let's focus again a little bit more detail here on the phases that we mentioned earlier. The aim of phase 1 is to determine how much of the drug is safe to give, what the side effects are, how the body copes with and processes the drug, and then maybe as well basic efficacy, for example, if the treatment shrinks the cancer. Phase 2 then is more focused heavily on the actual efficacy, having already established that there are no obvious side effects, adverse side effects. So if the new treatment works well enough to test in a larger phase 3 trial, so this is also preparing for that crucial phase 3 to ensure that it actually works well enough to be passed on to that phase 3. What types of, for example, cancer, if that's the disease being looked at, what types of cancer the treatment works for. It might be that the treatment works better for certain kinds of a disease than others, or certain strains of a disease. More about the side effects and how to manage them, and more about the best dose to use. And then finally, that crucial, critical phase 3 usually is used to compare a completely new treatment with the standard treatments that are already out there, and look at different doses or ways of giving and administering a standard treatment as well. This can be done in phase 3 if they're using, for example, an existing drug for new indications for treating other diseases. Now here we look at the success rate for the different phases. I briefly mentioned them in a previous slide, but let's look at it here in more fine detail. From phase 1 to phase 2, how many drugs get from phase 1 to phase 2 stands at about 63.2%, which is quite good. Then in phase 2 to phase 3, this is where things get a little trickier, and this is because they're focusing now more on the efficacy on the actual patients who suffer from the relevant disease. And so for that reason, you're likely to see a lower success rate here, especially given the fact that we're also dealing with larger numbers of patients generally in a phase 2 trial. So it's more likely to be discovered that it is just not as effective as was hoped. It only has efficacy with some patients who have very specific kinds of constitutions, for example, or capacities to deal with the drug in a way that other patients do not. You might be looking at patients at different stages of a disease, for example, and it might be discovered that At a certain stage of the disease, the drug works well, but at other stages or later stages, it is completely ineffective. So at that stage, often these drugs will fall out of favor or fall away as being deemed as unprofitable or unsustainable in the long run. And then phase 3, you hit around a 58.1% success rate. That may be a reflection of the fact that once it gets through those first 2 phases, you are looking at a lower probability then that simply by multiplying the numbers of patients upon whom this is tested, you're going to start seeing failures. So then when you get through to the NDA, BLA, this is the government regulatory bodies approval phase, you're looking at about an 85.3% success rate. But that reflects the fact that those previous phases, once you've demonstrated that it actually passes all of those previous clinical trials, you've demonstrated quite rigorously that it is a viable product. And so for that reason, it's hard for the regulatory agencies to justify a rejection at that point. Really, the most rejections actually come from bodies which have to do with looking at the commercial viability of a drug and looking at it from the perspective of the costs and whether or not it's justifiable in terms of prospective pricing. That can be actually the place where most of the drugs fall down in terms of regulatory approval. The other big issue has a lot to do with delay. It might not be the case that the regulatory agencies actually reject these drugs outright, but the more common threat and risk associated with this stage of approval seeking is the fact that these regulatory bodies will often drag their feet and delay and demand more tests before they actually accept and approve a particular drug. We're going to come back to the reasons why that might be the case a little bit later on. But look at this final column here on the right, phase 1 to approval. This looks at the overall likelihood or probability that a drug, once it starts trialing at phase 1, clinical trials at phase 1, the chances that it will actually get through to the end. We're looking at a chance of 9.6%. It's quite low probability that once you even start this trialing process, you're even going to get to the end. And that's even taking into account the fact that you've already gone through a huge amount of preclinical trialing as well, which is a hugely costly process in itself. So this is a fairly bleak outlook, it has to be said, from the perspective, if you're looking at it from simply the chances that one particular drug is going to make it all the way through to actually being able to be sold. So now we're looking here at the costs per phase. This is looking at the monetary costs per phase as opposed to looking at things like time and looking at probabilities of passing through each phase. Phase 3, as was indicated earlier, is the most costly phase given the amount of time it takes, the number of patients being trialed, the number of dimensions and aspects of the drug being looked at. And so that takes up approximately 28.7% of the total share of costs on the R&D process. Pre-human and preclinical then is the next most expensive, in and around 21.2% of the total costs of the research and development and approval phase. That comes in at around 11.272 thousand million or 11.2 billion US dollars, whereas phase 3 takes $15.2 billion. This was costs in the US overall in the pharmaceutical industry in 2014.